To paraphrase Marx's famous lines from the afterword of the second German edition of Capital, Volume 1, concerning Spinoza and Hegel, it was the good pleasure of the peevish, arrogant, mediocre epigones who at present talk large in cultured academia to treat Derrida, Hegel, as a dead dog. I therefore openly avow myself the pupil of that mighty thinker. Bluster aside, the sad fact is that it's necessary to engage in defensive action so that the work of this great philosopher not be lost to philosophy as a whole and the Marxist and radical projects in particular. This seems to be a real danger, and it's worth trying to understand the need for this defensive posture on the level of the specific threat, so to speak, to Derrida's work, and on the level of what motivates the attempt to delete him from our sights. Then there's the more constructive project of describing some ways in which Derrida's work is still very valuable for radical social critique and transformation. Now, of course, many have talked large in recent years against a whole raft of philosophers who are branded postmodern. Partisans of Zizek and Badiou dismissed Derrida on this score, even while the know-nothings just lob Zizek and Badiou in with the rest of them. And it sort of reminds me of the old joke about the anti-communist. You probably know this, right? The guy's standing at the edge of the demonstration. He says, "All this bystander, the cops are beating up demonstrators." They start beating up this guy. He says, no, I'm an anti-communist. And the cop says, "I don't care what kind of communist you are." You've probably heard that before. And so everything, even the people who are the critics of postmodernism, they'll get thrown in with the whole group too. And then you realize you just need to sort this out a little bit. It's important to get beyond the broad use of this term, which in philosophy can simply mean post-foundationalist philosophy, might be applied to everyone from Hegel to Quine. However, again, on the more constructive side of things, what is more important for social theory is to grapple with a society that has become postmodern and even postmodern capitalist, and see the ways that Derrida can help us with the impasse of such a society. Paralysis is a good term here too. A society that takes into its very core the idea that nothing can be fundamentally different. In other words, a society that's really just organized around that as a principle. But certainly there's a great deal of work on Derrida and Marxism at this point, and on the relationship of deconstruction to radical projects more generally. A lot of it's good stuff, I think. There are some new projects to be pursued, and then in this talk I want to outline some of them, and not just in a defensive mode. First, there are those moments so here's a list of 8. First, there are those moments in Derrida's earlier work that should be developed further in the context of the deconstructive Marxism. I've always found this passage in Auf Grammatology that's responding to Claude Lévi-Strauss on Strauss's comparison of Marxism and Buddhism on the question of exploitation of man by man. Just this fascinating passage that nobody's ever really picked up on. I want to say a little more about it. I can read the passage later if anyone wants to hear it. And second, one interesting aspect of this passage is that what it perhaps really is an engagement with Althusser and structuralist Marxism. And Derrida and Althusser were close friends, but they also fought like dogs and cats quite a lot. And even in his eulogy for Althusser, Derrida said that they were very close, but there was a lot of yelling in their relationship, and he said, and frankly, it was Althusser doing most of the yelling. Derrida didn't really write much about Althusser, but I'm guessing that this response to Lévi-Strauss was really a kind of oblique response. And that whole historical, political, and philosophical context of all those engagements, I think, still bears a lot more examination. Third, much of the Marxism and deconstruction work was done before Derrida's major so-called political texts of the 1990s, Spectres of Marx and Politics of Friendship. And so in the defensive mode, again, we might speculate on why the deconstructive Marxist project didn't kick into high gear at that point. And more constructively, we need to take account of these contributions. And I would say especially that these contributions go in a fundamentally different direction for either reversion to Marxist mechanistic orthodoxy or the more ludic and desire-oriented arguments of either the situationists or Deleuze. And I frankly think this is very important, not so much in the case of the situationists and Deleuze and Guattari, who I still think have a lot to give us, but there is a kind of consensus, and I even hear it here at the conference, that in the end, if we're going to go with Marx, we have to kind of settle on the more economistic sort of interpretation. And to me, one of the great values of what Zizek and Badiou are doing is that they are still, sometimes in ways that are screwed up or in ways that are sort of merely provocative, but I think they still want to underline the idea of communism and something other than simply a kind of leftist progressivism that operates within the existing parameters. Fourth, Derrida's book Rogues, which was the last book that he himself actually prepared for publication. If you've read this, it's a rather grim and even morbid book, a grim world during the George administration, especially as concerns the theologized notion of unconditional sovereignty put forth by Bush and his cronies. And we might ask two questions about this. Number one, is this analysis helpful for understanding this extraordinary post-9/11 period? And here we could also look at the interview that was mentioned by Jim, that's in the Philosophy of Time Terrorists, post-9/11 interview. Very quick, funny story about that. I was actually asked to read that manuscript by Derrida and Habermas for University of Chicago Press, which was a pretty weird thing. In other words, well, we have this manuscript of what Derrida and Habermas say about 9/11. Should we publish it? No. No, why would you want to do that? But then secondly, what do we make of what appears to be this time of transition? Obviously, I mean the transition to Obama, and read about it, or is it merely cosmetic? And I'm going to come back to that. Fifth, on the animal question, I think this is rising in profile in social theory, even apart from ecological concerns. And Derrida contributes to this with another of his last books, The Animal That Therefore I Am. For my part, I'm very concerned with this question and the possibility of a radical social theory that builds on the significance of this question. So I think there's still much to be learned from Derrida on this. Sixth, and Althusser, and then also to Badiou and Zizek, it might be argued that Althusser opens up a number of projects that had been invisible to a Hegelian, humanist, and teleological perspective. There might be two divergent paths in each of these projects. And I've done a lot of study of Althusser just in the last couple of years, going back into Althusser and some of these writings that have been published more recently under the headings of Philosophy of the Encounter and the Humanist Controversy. And Althusser is so brilliant, but I think in many ways he's a kind of transitional figure. And then the question is, what is the outcome of, where do you go from Althusser, so to speak? And so I think there are these two divergent paths in the completion of this project, and one is under the heading of the problematics of language, what Althusser himself called a general theory of textuality, and the other is under the heading of science and mathematics. And we might further locate these proposals within the trajectories of phenomenology and existentialism on the one hand, and structuralism on the other hand. And in Badiou, I mean, one of the things I find fascinating about Badiou is he says that he has equal allegiance to both Sartre and Althusser, which I think is incredible and very much worth thinking about. And then use this background of this trajectory, this philosophical trajectory, to look at the critique of deconstruction as a faddist, as a kind of postmodern fad that should be rejected or at least surpassed. And so this investigation itself can be carried out on these two fronts. I think the graphical use proposal in mathematics gets us out of a primary focus on questions of language, meaning, and subjectivity. And obviously, that's sort of the usual wrap on so-called postmodernism. It's just words about words about words. These things are important to Badiou, especially the question of the subject. But in Badiou's philosophy, it's after the event of truth, so to speak. The subject comes after truth. But is it really the case that there are no questions of meaning in mathematics and that mathematics cannot be deconstructed?